Hi, I'm Taylor McGee here in my home studio. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make your own loom out of cardboard, as well as a couple different projects. You'll learn how to make woven bookmarks and woven necklaces, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about some other possibilities that you can do on your loom. Here's what you're going to need today. Start with a rectangular piece of cardboard. This one's about 10 inches by 5 inches, but yours can be a different size. That's totally fine. You're going to need a fork to push your weaving together, a tapestry needle, although you can weave just using your hands, or a paper clip can help as well. Good pair of scissors. Going to need some warp thread. Warp threads are the vertical threads that go on your loom. That's what holds your weaving together. The most important thing about warp thread is just that it's something strong and durable. So I have a cotton yarn here. If you don't have that, you might try twine or any kind of strong string that you have on hand. Ruler and a pencil, and then the fun part, your yarn. If you don't have yarn, totally fine. Lots of different yarn alternatives. You can try cutting strips of fabric from old sheets or pillowcases. You can make yarn from t-shirts. You can weave with plastic bags. Really lots of possibilities. The first step in creating your loom is making marks for your notches. So you want to make marks at every 1/4 inch along both the bottom and the top of your loom, and you can see I've made those marks across there as well. Then once you've made those marks, you're going to cut along those marks that you've just created, and I usually go about a half an inch to an inch down on those marks. And you're going to do that all the way across, again on both the bottom and the top of your loom. I've already done those there. To warp your loom, you are going to get out that strong thread that you have, and for this we're just going to warp the center because we're making a bookmark or a necklace. I'll show you later in the video how you can warp across the entire loom to make a larger project, but for now we're just going to string up the center. So you're going to start by hooking one end of your thread through one of the notches, and you're going to leave a little tail on the end there that you can secure with a piece of tape. Then you're going to come around to the front and draw that string up to the notch directly across from it. For this project, we're also going to wrap around the entire loom. Again, for something like a wall hanging, you would only warp up the front, and I will show you that later in the video. But for this one, we're going to go around the front and back. And if you miss a notch, you can just go back and redo it. No big deal. You're going to do this until you have 8 warp threads on both the front and the back. And you want to make sure that you end on the bottom. I'll show you what I mean. So now that I have 8, I'm going to draw it up. My tail, I'm going to draw it up through this last notch here. Cut that off, and again secure it with a piece of tape. But you see I have both my ends started at the bottom and they ended here at the bottom, and that will make sure that you have enough strings all the way across on both sides. To begin weaving, you're going to cut a length of yarn or fabric, whatever material you're using, about 1 foot to 1.5 feet. For a small project like this, you only need to work with small lengths at a time. I'm going to be using the tapestry needle, but again, it's really easy to use your fingers to lift up the warp threads. The most basic weave is called a plain weave, and it's just alternating over and under. So I'm going to start under, go over, under, over, under, over, under, over. And I'm going to pull it all the way through until I just have a little tail piece hanging out. And I'm simply going to tuck that tail piece in, a couple of warp threads, and then use my fork or your hands to push that together. Notice I did start my weaving about 1.5 inches to 2 inches up from the bottom. That's going to leave space for me to tie knots off to secure the bottom of my bookmark or necklace. Once you go across, you're going to come back, and since I ended over this last warp thread, for my next row I'm going to go under, then over, under, over, under, over, and again, every time you go through, you want to pull that thread all the way to the end and push it together. Those little tail pieces, I usually just leave them hanging out until they have been secured in place, and then I go back and trim them once, and I'll show you that once you get a little further along, but you can just leave them in the meantime. A couple things to be mindful of when you're weaving. When you pull your yarn through, if you pull it too tight, you will create kind of a crooked or wavy edge. This is something that takes a lot of practice, so don't worry about it being too perfect, but there are a couple of things you can do to help keep your edges straight. One is a technique called bubbling, so that is when you create a bubble when you pull your thread through, and what that does is build in a little bit of slack so that your thread's not pulling on that last warp thread, so you can bubble and then push your thread down. Or you can pull it through at a diagonal. It's the same thing, building in a little bit of room for slack, and just kind of keep your finger on that last warp thread to make sure you're not pulling it in too tightly, and push it together. And when you're all done with this color, you can simply tuck it in just a couple of warp threads and trim it off. Again, we'll leave that tail out until we weave along a little bit more. If you want to create shapes in your weaving, you will continue with the plain weave, but rather than going all the way across your loom, you're going to stop where you want that shape to stop. Pull it through here like this, and I'm going to keep going, working my thread up just in this area. And you can do that till you have the desired shape, just like this. To fill in this shape and connect them, you're going to weave through until you meet the shape you've already woven. And I need to go over this warp thread, so you're going to find the shared warp thread of those shapes and use your needle to go under it and then weave back through. Continue, kind of spread the threads apart. Go under and weave back through, and this will connect your shapes. So you're going to continue weaving and create a design you like. Don't be afraid to experiment with other materials you might have in your house. You can also play with texture by doubling up your yarn or your fabric as you weave it through. Again, lots of different things to try out. When you get a design that you're happy with, you're going to weave and stop until you have about, again, 1.5 to 2 inches at the top. This one is going to be a bookmark, so that's why I wove all the way until I had that space at the top, which is where I'm going to tie my knots. We also have these little ends to deal with, so now that we have woven and we've pushed everything together, you're simply going to take those ends and trim them off. I know that's scary, but they are not going to go anywhere because we have woven them in. So you're going to do that all along your weaving until you have cleaned it up. Be sure that you don't trim off any tails that haven't been secured yet. Once we tie the knots, then I'll go back and trim that off. So before you cut off your bookmark, if you warped all the way around to the back, you do have an opportunity to create 2 bookmarks. For sake of time, I'm not going to do that, but you can imagine you would have woven what's on the front and on the back, and then when you cut it off, you can actually get 2 bookmarks, 2 projects out of this one warp. Another option is if you wanted to make a necklace, you would have just stopped with the little size of the woven pendant that you wanted to make. The same way of tying off is going to apply. I'll show you the difference with how you would make a chain for your necklace, but again, tying it off is the same process. When you're ready to remove your weaving from the loom, you're going to get a good pair of scissors and slide it under those bottom warp threads, pull it down, and cut. Before taking it off the loom, I like to tie my knots, and again, this is why you wanted to leave a good amount of space at the bottom so you had room to easily tie knots. So I'm going to tie these all the way across, 2 at a time, and then once I've done that, I will then show you how to remove the top from the loom. I've tied my knots across the bottom. You're welcome to brush those out, trim them, cut them off all together. That's up to you. When you're ready for the top, you do the same thing. Cut off those top warp threads and tie your little knots at the top. And remember, if you did do a bookmark on the back, then you would repeat the same process for that. I finished tying my knots, and you might notice when you take it off the loom that some things shift a little bit, so you might just have to clean up some of your ends again. I went ahead and trimmed off that last little tail piece that was hanging out, but yeah, then you have a nice little usable bookmark. If you decided to make the necklace, then like I said, the process is the same. Gonna start by cutting off the bottom warp threads and tying them. Then once you tie those, you can lift this off the loom. Cut off these top threads. You'll secure the top with knots as well, and then tie all of these together to make the chain of your necklace. And you can see a finished product here. So I tied off those little ends and the top, and then the chain like this. You can also make a larger wall hanging project on this loom. The only difference is that you would warp across the entire loom, so starting in one corner and going all the way across, and you don't need to warp the entire front and back. So you can see when I was going up and down, I just would hook around the notch, come back to the front, and go back. So you don't need to warp all the way across. And then also, so 3 things, you would not cut your loops at the top. So with our bookmark, we cut the bottom loops and the top loops and tied off. You would just cut the bottom loops, tie knots to secure it, and then you would leave the loops on top. And here's another example. So this was on the loom. I cut off the bottom, tied those, and then the top ones I simply lifted off, and those loops became a place where I could put a dowel for hanging. So I hope you saw today that once you learn the basics of weaving, there are pretty much endless possibilities to what you can create. And I did want to share some more resources with you in case this is something you enjoyed and you want to know a little bit more about. One of my favorites is on the Loom, A Modern Weaver's Guide by Marianne Moody, who is a fiber artist based in Australia. She has a lot of great illustrations in here showing you different weaving techniques as well as DIY projects. Everything from making a woven chandelier to using a giant cardboard loom to make a really fun scarf. So that's a good one. The Weaving Loom is a blog online. She also has a lot of posts that answer really specific weaving questions. And then of course, please feel free to reach out to me. You can message me on Instagram at Taylor McGee Art. I would love to see what you create, so share that with me, and I'd love to share it with our community. I really appreciate you watching today. Hope you'll check out some of the other classes that the Art Center is offering, and stay creative.